This is a special edition of DW News Africa. We're in Johannesburg, host city of the first G20 leaders meeting on African soil. South Africa's government has declared this G20 Africa summit, promising to raise the continent's voice on the international stage. High up on the agenda is Africa's debt crisis. 2 in 3 Africans are living in a country whose government is spending more on paying debt than on healthcare and education. We will ask South Africa's finance minister what the G20 has done to address this. And a special G20 report says inequality is one of the world's most urgent concerns. Economic justice activists tell us what governments should do to solve it. Hello from downtown Johannesburg. I'm Christine Mundo. It's good to have your company. For the first time ever, the meeting of G20 leaders is being held in Africa. South Africa promised to represent the continent from the head of the table when it took over the G20 presidency. And this is being seen as an important moment for Africa, where governments want to rally their international partners to support Africa's growth and development. G20 members include 19 countries, some of them the richest in the world, and 2 regional blocs, the European Union and since 2023, the African Union. The group represents 2/3 of the world's population. Africa's debt crisis has been at the heart of this year's G20 agenda. In a moment, we will hear from South Africa's finance minister on what progress was made to help Africa's indebted countries. The level of debt has reached record levels and it is holding back the continent's development. DW's Tomi Oladipo explains.
Across Africa, governments are running out of money, and debt is a major reason why. As a government, spending 5 to 10% of your income on interest payments is generally considered manageable. But for roughly half of Africa, it's now between 20 to 30%, and that leaves far less money for essential services like health or education. Public debt has risen sharply. In 2010, African governments owed about 1/3 of their yearly economic output. By 2020, that figure was closer to 60%, and in places like Ghana, Zambia, or Kenya, even higher. Now the bills are due and many countries can't pay. So how did we get here? In the 2010s, there was a lot of borrowing. Many countries took advantage of low global interest rates to get funds for major infrastructure projects and public services. The idea was simple. Borrow money cheaply, build roads, ports and power plants, grow the economy and pay it back later. And how does debt work? A government sells bonds to investors, basically IOUs. The government receives the cash, pays interest yearly and returns the full amount on a set date. For example, if you borrow $2 billion, you might pay $100 million a year in interest over, say, 10 years and return the full $2 billion at the end. Who are the lenders? It used to be mostly Western governments, the World Bank and the IMF. But after the 2008 global financial crisis, they pulled back. So African countries turned to more costly private lenders and China. The higher interest rates that's brought have to do with perception, because it's not just about whether you can pay what you owe, but about whether lenders think you can. Credit rating agencies grade countries on how risky they are to lend to. Lower grades mean paying higher interest. Many African countries are labeled high risk, even when their economies look similar to others with better scores. And that's often influenced by stereotypes and negative media coverage. Now, remember all that borrowing in the 2010s? Borrow cheap, invest, grow, and pay back? Well, a lot's happened since then. The pandemic, the war in Ukraine, inflation, rising global interest rates, and shocks to the commodity markets, which African countries rely on. So they're not earning enough money to pay their old loans, and new borrowing is more expensive. Meanwhile, domestic costs are rising, populations are growing, climate disasters are hitting harder, and people need healthcare and education. So a few countries have defaulted and had to enter negotiations to find a way out. 9 countries are in debt distress, meaning they're struggling to pay, while more are at risk.
So South Africa was able to, in partnership with the AU, get a G20 declaration on debt within the finance track, which was not an easy task given the current context as well. That declaration acknowledges that there is a need for urgent reform of the G20 common framework that allows, timely and effective resolution of debt challenges, not just for African countries, but for developing countries more broadly. But also what that means is being able to implement those solutions allows African countries to then open up their fiscal space to be able to channel more resources in critical sectors like education and health, where many of these countries have had to make a choice between debt service payments and meeting those development objectives.
So the question isn't whether African countries can repay these debts, but what they must sacrifice to do so.
I sat down with Enoch Godongwana, South Africa's finance minister. He started by giving me his assessment of the debt crisis in Africa. I also asked him what the G20 under South Africa's presidency has done to address it.
Debt is a fundamental problem on the African continent, and it has been there for years. So it's a problem which undermines growth in these economies. It's also crowding out investment on social services such as education and health. People in these countries are paying more debt than paying for education and health in their own economies. So that extent of the crisis you have. And what compounds this matter is an absence of domestic capital. And therefore people are forced to raise foreign capital at a huge cost.
Right.
Related to that is the fact that there's always an assumption that Africa is too risky, and therefore the cost of capital must be expensive. So those are the issues we're grappling with.
Just on that thread about why the cost of borrowing is so high, what is the reason for that, if you can expand on that?
Let me just give you an example now. If some rating agencies I've placed that in a lower grade than countries with similar fiscal metrics than us, which reflects the bias against the African continent. That you find throughout. What the study we've done now with the African panel of experts is to begin to produce data, and it's data-driven. And among the recommendations we're placing in that is that the multinational institution must make sure that there's a data-driven kind of borrowing and lending, in a sense that you can be able to compare equals with equals on the basis of the data that's available. At the moment, irrespective of the data, there's a bias against the African continent, and therefore its cost.
So, Minister, over the years, we've seen that China has increasingly become a more sort of prominent lender to African countries. And I guess this has been a bit of an alternative in an environment where there's limited capital available to African countries, but also the capital that is available is very expensive. So we saw a lot more loans coming in from China. From where you sit, is this a good thing?
Good and bad. Good in the sense that China is able to provide and fill the gap which the developed world have created by not investing on the African continent. And China has been able, therefore, to provide the resources necessary. However, is that part of the difficulty with the Chinese staff is opaque. There's no transparency about how these loans work, and so on and so on. And therefore, there has been reluctance on their part in the debate about transparency.
Some Western creditors have indicated a level of willingness to forgive some of Africa's debt.
Yeah.
The condition has been that China has to do the same.
It's going to do the same.
Have you, as African countries, engaged the Chinese in terms of the conversation of debt relief? And what sort of resistance are you meeting from Beijing?
The engagement thus far has been taken on a case-by-case basis. It has not been a collective endeavor to engage them. But there's also a challenge. I mean, somebody was telling me that sometimes because of our weakness, you don't want to be seen to be standing up against the big guys. in case you get isolated and penalized. So I suspect that also there's a fear factor in some of these issues.
South Africa wanted to use its G20 presidency to get relief for indebted African countries. And yet, Minister, critics would say that there hasn't been any progress, right? They will say that the restructuring of the debt has been too slow, and that any reduction of the debt is too shallow.
Look, there's genuine criticism. First and foremost, we agreed in the G20 on what is called an agreement called Common Framework, G20 Common Framework. That's an agreement whose intention is to facilitate debt reduction. Okay? A, it's a voluntary process for a country to come to it. B, you negotiate on a case-by-case basis. It does not have a fixed outcome. So it becomes, in that sense, more cumbersome. It takes time. It took us about 2 years to deal with the Zambian situation. So in that sense, it's a problem. So, and therefore, it's also too shallow, as you have indicated. We are urging for a different form of debt relief. First and foremost, it must not only focus on the debt, it must also focus on refinancing the existing debt on different terms. Let me just give an example. If you go to the open market and you have paid 800 basis points, and that's what you are doing in servicing your debt. But if a multinational institution comes in, refinance that debt at 300 basis points, I'm just using that as an example. What that means is that your cost of capital becomes lower. So first and foremost, that's what the panel we've created is intended to achieve, to create a negotiating environment around those things. Secondly, to create a negotiating environment against this bias that we are risking, which necessitates this higher cost of capital. So we accept that criticism, that there's still a battle to be fought inside the G20.
Minister, while we're talking about the multinational or multilateral institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, these institutions are viewed with a lot of skepticism on the African continent. What kind of reform is needed within these institutions so that they serve Africa better?
Here's the challenge. We need to reform these institutions in terms of representation and so on. For instance, the IMF, we only had 2 executive directors at the whole African continent, right? Sub-Saharan Africa. 2 executive directors that sit into it. We've just made a change now. We've got a 3rd chair, which is increasing our voice into, that's one form of transformation, to increase our voice in the institution. But we also have got to do our own. In other words, we've got to manage our economies better. But you can't say you're going to resolve your problem by getting handouts. We've got to manage our economies in such a manner that we don't rely on being bailed out by these institutions. Then we must fight this battle, which makes the cost of capital for us to be expensive in such a manner that you will depend forever on borrowing.
What is it going to take to liberate us, one, from this debt trap, if there is one, but also for us as a continent to secure a better deal?
Liberation is a function of unity. All the struggles for liberation that have been fought on the basis of unity. The dilemma we face in the African continent is that we hardly have any unified position on any issue when it comes to interacting with the global world. They've been successful in using the divide and rule strategy. I mean, a case in point, we have Israel beating up Palestine. All of a sudden, Israel pops up as an observer in the AU. How do you see that? When we can't accept Burkina Faso on the basis that they've got a military rule. You know what I mean? it is that kind of inconsistency and which makes us vulnerable, because we can't present a united face on any issue. And that makes us, in the absence of that unity, we can't present a united front.
Minister Godongwana, thanks very much for your time here on DW.
Thank you.
Speaking ahead of the summit, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa said that the burden of debt was widening inequality. And a G20 report says inequality is one of the world's most urgent concerns. As G20 hosts this year, South Africa has called on world leaders to set up a special panel to examine the causes of inequality and develop solutions. More than 30 years after the end of apartheid, South Africa is often referred to as the world's most unequal country. The country's economic capital, Johannesburg, epitomizes the problem of systemic imbalances. DW's Diane Hawker reports.
When you live in a place like Diepsloot, shacks for homes packed tightly along poor quality roads and little prospect of getting out. A place like Thatchfield, large houses surrounded by green lawns, can seem like a distant dream. These two places are less than 15 kilometers apart in Johannesburg, but the lives lived within them are worlds apart. Richard Dube is 24. He lives in Diepsloot, and although he graduated high school, he's been having trouble finding a job and making ends meet. Recently, he started doing woodwork to try to make some money, but it's difficult to find new customers in Diepsloot.
Well, it's been really tough, maybe that's the reason why, we can't have, those opportunities, because some people are scared to come here because they think that Diepsloot is very dangerous, but which is not true.
John Tavengwa is Dube's uncle. After seeing how his nephew and other young residents were struggling to get jobs, he decided to do something. Using recycled building materials, members of the Bambanani Rainbow Skills Development Organization are trying to create a center where they can turn local fortunes around.
We can give them skills like mechanical skills, carpentry skills, farming, building skills. And there is a lot of skills that we can bring up to teach the communities, so that we can fight this inequality.
But when this is your home, where the schools are underfunded, healthcare is difficult to access, and there are few jobs available, the route to a better future can seem blocked by everything around you. It's a problem recognized by important thinkers. Joseph Stiglitz is a Nobel laureate economist. He heads the G20 Inequality panel.
You're always going to have some inequality, but we have, in the last quarter century, just built up extremes of inequality that should be morally reprehensible and that actually interfere with the way our economy works, with the way our politics works, and with the way our society works.
It's very clean and it's a completely different environment.
Richard sees the distance between the haves and the have-nots when we take him to nearby Thatchfield.
So when you look at an area like this, do you think that the people that live here actually know what your experience is like in Diepsloot?
Yeah, truly speaking, I think they know the conditions, but they don't really care because they don't stay there, If they come where we come from, they would understand and they try to help us in some sort of way.
Inequality experts say the people who should try to help are those leading governments in the G20.
Civil society groups say political leaders need to take bold steps in order to fix global inequality. I caught up with an economic justice activist about what their message is to G20 leaders. Samam Tunzi, welcome to DW News Africa. You are a South African national, and this country is often referred to as the most unequal country in the world. Give us a sense of what the lived experience for South Africans is in a country where there's such vast inequality.
It's quite difficult. We live in a country where, inequality and wealth is just separated by a street. you grow up on one side as, the shanty towns, and the other side is the lofty suburbs, and that has caused a lot of violence, and that's why South Africa then matches that with the highest levels of violence against women, high levels of crime, high levels of killings that are coming from the socio-economic formation that we find ourselves in this country, and it continues to be perpetuated, and the patterns of apartheid still live with us today.
As civil society, you have been critical of how political leaders around the world are dealing with inequality. What is your rallying call? You've been included as civil society in this G20 summit. What is your message to political leaders who will be gathering here, and perhaps even those who aren't represented at this G20, about the issue of inequality and what decisive action is needed?
I think inequality globally has been widening, and all the solutions that have been brought forward in the past seem not to be working. We're sitting today at the G20 Leaders Summit for the first time in the African continent, where African leaders and African states and civil society has been burning on the issue of debt, which is increasing inequality, the issue of taxation, which has taken a step forward in terms of the UN Tax Convention. Debt crisis cannot be ignored. It must be acknowledged in how countries spend so much more on servicing debt from kind of wealthy creditors instead of spending on kind of basic services. And we've seen how, African countries and lower income countries, over 54 countries now in a debt crisis, they spend more on repaying loans instead of paying for health services and education. 50% of those are paying double in payments on debt more than actually on national developmental programs. So now countries have to sacrifice human rights, have to sacrifice sustainable development goals that have gone off track because countries are stuck at a point of repaying debts.
So what should the global community be doing to address the challenges that are exacerbating inequality? You're talking about debt.
Well, coming from, the G20 common framework that will take some of the resolution and the declaration that will come from this meeting is to look at debt and how we can deal with debt and how private creditors can stop bullying African states and lower income countries, and that we have a body that is democratic, that is central at the UN, that can protect poor countries from entering to irresponsible debt, and that we have a situation where we get countries that build revenue that can pay for public services, that can pay for their national developmental projects. Of course, there's been big calls, not just at the African level, but also with the Group of Africa in the UN about debt restructuring, which means that we need a mechanism of debt that can be maintained and monitored to make sure that unsustainable debt levels don't get into critical forms that we find ourselves in now. We have a process now happening in the UN offices in Nairobi, Kenya, whereby there's universal and global tax laws that are negotiated to enter a body that is representative, to enter a body that will help defend African states from exploitation. So the debt crisis that we find ourselves in also needs debt cancellations. We're at a level where we go back to the 2000s, the Jubilee year, whereby tax cancellations had to be done. Otherwise, countries were reaching financial crisis that we couldn't live with.
What bold steps do political leaders need to take to make sure that we have a more equitable world to deal with inequality?
We are hoping that the UN Tax Conventions take on the issue of illicit financial flows, which takes much of the wealth out of the continent and lower income countries. And we think that those two issues are quite critical in terms of speaking of any kind of national development, international development with regards to the African continent.
People talk of Africa being in a debt trap or in a vicious cycle of poverty. Are you optimistic about the continent's prospects if the right policies are put in place? Or do you feel that perhaps this isn't getting the attention that it deserves and likely not to improve?
Well, what we're seeing now is that the financial crisis is showing itself around the world. The young people, the Gen Z protests that are spreading around. We had the huge protest in Kenya against the finance bill, and young people are trying to break away from the system that is holding them back within an exclusive socio-economic status. So we're hoping, as young people, that we don't only push from within, we push from outside in terms of pressuring governments and people who hold power to take the issues seriously. We still have, African countries that are stuck into these kind of high interest rate loans that have small time frames, and they are stuck in this loop of having to service debt instead of kind of like financing the socio-economic development. So we are at a point that we need to break those and be able to give countries a little bit of room to breathe, to be able to contribute to socio-economic development. Otherwise, if countries are still locked into these agreements, which are driven by private banks mostly, that are motivated by profit first, we'll find ourselves in a situation whereby we can't speak on social development without resolving the debt.
Sama Mthunzi, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
That's where we'll leave it for this special edition of DW News Africa. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.